My stepmother threw a $50,000 fully catered open house to sell my late father's ancestral estate to a luxury buyer, and she invited me specifically so I could watch her do it. What she did not know was that the estate had been locked in an irrevocable blind trust for 5 years, transferring complete ownership to me. She owned nothing in that house, not the furniture, not the driveway, not the air. I arrived. I drank her champagne. I watched her hand a $200,000 earnest money check to an escrow agent. And then I put the certified trust documentation on the table. Here is exactly what happened when her own hired security escorted her off my property. My father was a man who built things, not metaphorically, literally. He was a civil engineer who had transitioned into development in his 40s and who had spent the following 2 decades constructing a portfolio of real estate assets that by the time I was a teenager constituted something worth protecting. He was methodical, private, and had the specific quality that I have come to associate with people who build real wealth rather than performing it. He was patient. He was willing to wait longer than other people were comfortable waiting because he understood that the thing worth having is rarely available on the timeline you would prefer. I inherited this quality directly and without deviation. My mother died when I was 11. My father grieved for several years with the thoroughness of a man who had genuinely loved someone, and then, when I was 16, he met Constance. Constance was 41 when she married my father, 7 years his junior, and she was, I will give her this, extraordinarily good at the presentation of herself. She was well-dressed, well-spoken, socially fluent in the way of someone who has studied the rooms she wants to be in and learned their codes. She was the kind of beautiful that requires constant maintenance and substantial investment, which she applied with the dedication of a professional, because it was, in every practical sense, her profession. She had been married once before, briefly, to a man whose primary qualification had been his credit line. The marriage lasted 18 months and produced my stepbrother Dominic, who was 4 years younger than me and who had absorbed entirely and without reservation the worldview his mother curated, that the world owed him a lifestyle he had not built, and that the people around him existed to fund it. Dominic drove cars he couldn't afford on leases he didn't understand, wore clothes whose price tags he mentioned in conversation, and had the specific confidence of a man who has been told since childhood that confidence is sufficient replacement for competence. He had never held a job for longer than 7 months. He referred to himself in social settings as an entrepreneur. The ventures he described were uniformly in the planning phase. I watched all of this from a distance. I had put there deliberately. I had left home at 22 with a finance degree and a clear-eyed understanding that the household I was departing was not one that rewarded building, it rewarded performing, and I was not interested in performance. I built my own portfolio over the following 8 years, quietly, methodically, in the way my father had taught me before Constance arrived and complicated the lesson. Real estate, structured investments, a small fund I started with 3 other analysts from my graduate program that had grown beyond what any of us had projected. I did not tell Constance or Dominic the details of what I had built. This was not secrecy for its own sake. It was the natural result of understanding that information provided to people who will weaponize it is a liability. Constance believed I was comfortable but not wealthy. She had calibrated this assessment from my car, my apartment's location, and the absence of the specific social performance that she understood as the indicator of money. She was wrong, but she was wrong in a direction that served me, so I allowed it to remain. My father's realization came slowly. the way most important realizations do. He was not a naive man, but he had made a choice with his heart during a period of grief, and the architecture of that choice had taken years to fully reveal itself. By the time he understood what Constance's priorities actually were, not him, not the marriage, but the access the marriage provided, he had been in it long enough that the unwinding was complicated. He did not unwind it. He made a different calculation. 5 years before his death, my father met with his estate attorneys, privately, without informing Constance, which he was legally entitled to do, because separate property can be managed without spousal disclosure when it predates the marriage and has been properly maintained as separate. He established an irrevocable blind trust. I want to explain what this means because the legal specificity matters. An irrevocable trust, once established, cannot be amended, modified, or revoked by the grantor, the person who creates it. The assets placed inside it are no longer, in any legal sense, the property of the grantor. They belong to the trust. The grantor has no ability to reclaim them, mortgage them, sell them, or otherwise encumber them. For estate purposes, this means the assets do not pass through probate. They are not part of the estate that is subject to inheritance claims, spousal rights, or legal challenge in the way that standard testamentary assets are. The trust named me as the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. My father transferred the ancestral estate, a 12-room Georgian manor house on 14 acres, appraised at the time of transfer at approximately $3.8 million and worth considerably more at the time of these events, into the trust. Constance received what the marriage legally entitled her to receive, which was a portion of the assets accumulated during the marriage. These were not insubstantial, but the estate, the house, the grounds, the assets she had spent a decade calculating as her security, was not among them. She did not know this. My father had never told her. I had known for 3 years, because he had told me privately, in a conversation that I hold separately from most memories because of the weight it carried. He said, "I want you to have what your mother and I built before any of this. I want you to have what actually belongs to you." He died 14 months after that conversation, natural causes. He had been ill for the last year of his life, which Constance had managed with the performance of a devoted wife in public, and, I had reason to believe, a growing impatience in private, as the timeline became clear and the question of what came after began to dominate her attention. The death was a Tuesday. By Thursday, Constance was on the phone with a luxury real estate broker. I want to describe the speed of Constance's grief because it tells you everything you need to know about the nature of what she had spent a decade building. She cried at the funeral. She wore the appropriate clothes, held the appropriate expressions, received condolences with the gracious composure of a woman who has been to enough society events to know how to perform any required emotion on the appropriate timeline. It was an impressive performance. Several of my father's friends told me afterward how extraordinary she was. I thanked them. By the following Monday, 4 days after the funeral, she had commissioned an appraisal. By Thursday of the following week, 8 days after the funeral, she had retained the most prominent luxury real estate brokerage in the region. By the end of that month, she had planned what she was calling an exclusive private showing event for a curated list of high-net-worth buyers. $50,000 in catering, floral arrangements, staffing, and, most useful to my purposes, private security to maintain the exclusivity of the event. She invited me. The invitation arrived by email, which told me something about the register in which she intended the event to operate, formal enough for a paper trail, casual enough that she could later claim it was simply a family courtesy. The email was short. She said she wanted me to be present for the transition of the family property. She said she hoped we could put any past difficulties behind us. She said Dominic was looking forward to seeing me. The language was the language of a woman who had decided that magnanimity, performed publicly, would preempt any objection I might raise. She had not considered the possibility that my objection would be documented, certified, and carried in a leather folio. I consulted my estate attorneys the morning after receiving the invitation. The trust documents were as airtight as they had been when my father established them. My attorney, a woman named Patricia, who has been practicing estate law for 26 years and who communicates exclusively in the language of ironclad certainty, reviewed the current situation and delivered her assessment in approximately 4 sentences. She said, "Constance has no legal standing to sell this property. The trust owns the estate. I am the trustee. Any contract she signs in connection with this property is fraudulent on its face and will not survive contact with a title search." She asked if I wanted to notify Constance now or allow the situation to develop. I told her I would attend the open house. Patricia looked at me for a moment. She said, "Bring the certified copies." I said I intended to. She made a note and closed her folder. The day of the open house was in early autumn, which was appropriate. The weather was the kind that makes large properties look their best, the leaves beginning to turn on the 14 acres, the light low and golden on the Georgian stonework. There were 11 cars in the drive when I arrived. Several of them were extraordinary, the kind of vehicles that exist at the intersection of engineering and status signaling, purchased by people who have decided that subtlety is a virtue they can afford to skip. A catering truck was backed to the side entrance. 2 men in dark jackets and earpieces were stationed at the front gate. Private security. Her private security. I noted this. I parked my 4-year-old sedan in the furthest available space and walked to the entrance with my leather folio under my arm. The interior of the house was, I will say this, spectacular. Constance had hired a staging company. The furniture was not my father's. It had been replaced with rented pieces from an interior design firm that specialized in luxury property presentation. The effect was immaculate and entirely impersonal, the way staged houses are impersonal, designed to project aspiration rather than inhabitation. My father's study, where he had kept his first engineering drawings framed on the wall, had been converted into a wine presentation area. I looked at the space where the drawings had been. I looked for a moment. Then I moved on. Constance found me within 4 minutes of my arrival. She was wearing a shade of blue that I recognized as a color she associated with authority. She had a habit of color coordinating her presentations of self to the impression she wanted to create, which I had observed over a decade of involuntary proximity. She kissed the air beside my cheek and said how glad she was I could come, in the voice of a woman who is glad in the specific way that a cat is glad to have the mouse in a contained space. She said, "You look well." I said, "The house looks different." She said, "Yes, the staging is wonderful, isn't it? It shows the potential of the space." A pause, the performance of sympathy. "It's been so difficult deciding to let it go, but practically speaking, a property like this needs stewardship that I simply can't provide on my own." I said, "Of course." She moved on to her next guest. Dominic appeared shortly after, wearing a suit that was too new and too fitted to have been bought for any other occasion, bought specifically to perform "Successful Son" at family estate event. He shook my hand with the grip of a man who has read that firm handshakes communicate dominance and who executes them with such self-consciousness that the communication is entirely lost. He said, "Good of you to come." I said, "I wouldn't have missed it." He looked at the folio under my arm. He said, "What's that?" I said, "Documents." He looked at it for a moment longer, then decided the question wasn't worth pursuing and moved toward the champagne station. I took a glass and positioned myself near the window overlooking the east grounds. I watched. The buyers were serious. This was not a casual showing. 3 of the parties present had attorneys with them, which indicated intent rather than curiosity. 2 of the real estate agents were moving through the rooms with the practiced fluency of professionals who have done this enough times that the performance is natural. The catering was excellent. The flowers were exceptional. Constance moved through the space with the ease of a woman who had been hosting events in this house for a decade and believed she would be hosting them indefinitely. She stopped twice near me to make remarks in the hearing of passing guests about my modest life choices, delivered as warmth and received as intended, a public calibration of my position relative to hers in a room she believed she owned. I noted each instance. I continued to watch. At approximately 2 hours into the event, I saw the signal I had been waiting for. Constance and the lead broker directed the most serious buyer, a man I will call Hargrave, who had arrived with 2 attorneys and a personal assistant, and who had been examining the property with the methodical attention of someone who has made very large purchases before, toward the library, which had been set up as a formal meeting space. A table, chairs, documents laid out. I gave them 7 minutes to settle. Then I walked in. I want to describe this room carefully because I have thought about it many times since. The library had been partially staged. Some of my father's books remained on the shelves because they were the kind of books that read as authenticity in a staging context, the leather-bound collections that signal intellectual heritage to buyers who are purchasing not just property, but the idea of a life. The table was long, dark wood, original to the house. Constance was at the head of it. Hargrave was across from her, 1 attorney on each side, his personal assistant slightly behind. The broker was beside Constance. A document, the preliminary purchase agreement I noted, along with an earnest money arrangement, was on the table between them. An escrow check sat in a leather holder near the broker's hand. $200,000 in the register I could see from the doorway. Constance looked up when I entered. She said, with the warmth of a hostess managing a minor interruption, "Darling, we're just finishing up some formalities. Give us 20 minutes. I said, "I don't think that's going to work." I walked to the table. I set the leather folio down. I opened it. I placed, in a single deliberate stack, the following documents: the original trust instrument, executed 5 years prior, the certified deed transferring the estate into the trust registration documentation from the county recorder's office, a letter from my attorney confirming the current legal status of the property and the identity of the trustee, and on top, a single page that was the clearest and most unambiguous document in the set, a 1-paragraph summary drafted by Patricia in the specific declarative language that estate attorneys use when they want something to be impossible to misread. It read, in essence, "The property known as the estate's legal address has been held in irrevocable trust since the date of transfer. The sole trustee and beneficiary is my name. No other party holds any legal interest in, claim to, or authority over this property. Any attempt to transfer, encumber, or sell this property by any person other than the trustee is without legal basis and constitutes fraud." I slid the stack across the table to Hargreaves' attorney. There is a specific kind of quiet that falls over a room when the people in it are processing a reclassification of reality. It is different from ordinary silence. It is silence with a texture, the sound of minds working at high speed while their owners hold very still. Hargreaves' first attorney read the top page. He read it again. He passed it to the second attorney. He looked at the remaining documents. He said to no one in particular, but with the clinical precision of a professional who has just identified a serious problem. "This property is in trust," Hargreaves said. "I'm sorry?" The attorney said, "The property is in trust, irrevocable. It cannot be sold by anyone other than the trustee." He looked at me. "Are you the trustee?" I said, "I am." The attorney looked at Constance. He said, "Can you explain your legal relationship to this property?" I watched Constance's face in this moment with the specific attention I had been cultivating for the past 2 hours, waiting for this exact expression, the one that arrives when a person's internal model of the world is revised without warning, and the revision is catastrophic. The color left her face in stages, not all at once, in stages, the way a tide retreats, pulling back from the shore in a sequence that is slow enough to watch and fast enough to be disorienting. She said, this is... She stopped. She looked at the documents. She looked at the broker. She looked at me. This isn't right. The estate is part of the family's, my husband's. The attorney said, with the neutrality of someone who is no longer in a meeting he intended to be in, "Ma'am, your husband's assets that were part of the marital estate would have passed through probate or under the terms of a will. This property did not. It was transferred into this trust prior to his death and is therefore not a probate asset. It's not subject to spousal inheritance rights." She said, "That's not..." She stopped again. "He wouldn't have..." I said quietly. "He did." She looked at me. I said, "He did it 5 years ago. He told me 3 years ago. I have the original documentation, the certified copies, and a letter from the trust's attorneys confirming the current status. I have a second set in my car." The room was very quiet. Hargreaves' attorney leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, in the way of a man who has just identified that he nearly signed a document that would have initiated a fraudulent real estate transaction and is relieved that he did not. Hargreaves said to his attorney, "Are we in any exposure here?" The attorney said, "No, you haven't signed anything yet. We're clean." He looked at Constance and the broker. "You, on the other hand, have some questions to answer." The meltdown, when it came, was not immediate. There was a moment, approximately 15 seconds, in which Constance sat very still and said nothing. And in that 15 seconds, I believe she was running through every possible exit from the situation and finding each one blocked. Then she said, with a rising quality in her voice that she could not entirely control, "This is not legal. This is some kind of scheme. They did this on purpose. He didn't understand what he was signing. He was being manipulated." I said, "He had 2 estate attorneys, his financial advisor and his accountant present when he signed. The witnesses are documented. His cognitive capacity at the time of signing is documented. His attorney can speak to that directly." She said, "I want a lawyer." I said, "That's an excellent idea." She said, and her voice was losing its control now, the architecture of the performance beginning to fail the way structures fail when the load-bearing element is compromised. "This is my house. I have lived here for 14 years. You can't..." I said, "You have lived here. You have not owned it. There's a legal distinction." She pushed back from the table. She said, Get out of my..." I looked at the security staff member who had followed the commotion and was now standing in the library doorway. I said, "Could you come in, please?" He came in. I said, "I am the owner of this property. I have documentation establishing that fact, which these attorneys have reviewed. I need you to escort everyone who is not a member of my family or the buyer's legal team off the premises, beginning with the event staff and brokers, and then, if she will not leave voluntarily, Mrs. Constance Whitmore." The security staff member looked at the attorney, who nodded once. He looked at his colleague in the doorway. He looked at Constance. He said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside." She said his company's name, loudly. He said, with the professional steadiness of someone who has made a decision, "Ma'am." She looked at me one more time. I looked back. I said nothing. She left. Dominic, who had been standing in the hallway outside the library for the last portion of this exchange, having been drawn by the elevated voices and standing with his champagne glass still in hand, wearing the expression of someone whose understanding of his life has just been revised in ways he has not yet fully calculated, also left. He did not say anything to me as he passed. I watched the 14 acres settle back into their October quiet. I stood in the library for a long moment. I looked at my father's books on the shelves. I walked to the east window. The grounds were still beautiful. They had always been beautiful. Here is what happened in the months that followed, in the order that it happened. Legal fallout. Constance retained an attorney. The attorney reviewed the trust documentation and, to his credit, gave her an honest assessment. The trust was valid, properly executed, and unassailable. Her claim to the property had no legal basis. She attempted the argument that my father had lacked proper understanding of what he was signing. This argument failed because my father was a civil engineer who had reviewed contracts professionally for 30 years, had been assessed as fully competent by his own physician at the time of the trust's execution, and had signed in the presence of 2 estate attorneys who documented his clear intent in understanding in detail that was, as Patricia described it to me, unusually thorough. The real estate broker faced a licensing review for having proceeded with a listing on a property without completing a proper title search, which would have immediately revealed the trust. The review was still ongoing at the time of this update. The County District Attorney's Office opened an inquiry into whether Constance's actions, specifically representing to buyers that she had the authority to sell a property she did not own, constituted attempted real estate fraud. The inquiry was ongoing. I have cooperated fully with all requests for documentation. Without the estate and without access to the assets that had been legally transferred, Constance's financial situation underwent a rapid revision. The lifestyle she had maintained, the property, the social memberships, the travel, the surface area of the life she had constructed had been funded by my father during his lifetime and premised in her planning on the estate sale that did not happen. The assets that came to her through the marital settlement were not what she had been counting on. The gap between what she had planned and what she had was significant. She moved out of the estate within 60 days of the open house, voluntarily to avoid the legal complications of being characterized as a trespasser in formal proceedings. Dominic's financial situation, which had been underwritten largely by Constance's anticipated inheritance, underwent its own revision. 2 lease arrangements terminated, the vehicles were collected. His partnership in a co-working space venture, which he had been describing in social settings as a major development, quietly dissolved. He moved into a rental property. He is, as far as I know, still calling himself an entrepreneur. Final verdict. I have been sitting in the library for the past hour, not doing anything in particular, reading for a while, looking at the grounds, allowing myself the specific luxury of time spent in a space that is simply mine, not contested, not performed for, not protected against, simply mine. I want to close with the thing that is actually true, as distinct from the satisfying structure of the story. My father was not perfect. He made a choice born of grief, and that choice had consequences he spent a decade managing and ultimately could not fully undo. The trust was not revenge on his part, or not primarily. It was the act of a man who was trying to make right, as cleanly as he could, a wrong he had committed through vulnerability. He wanted me to have what was mine. He did what he could to ensure it. That matters to me more than anything else in this story. Constance did not lose because I outsmarted her. She lost because she had built her entire plan on an assumption she had never verified. She had spent 14 years in proximity to a man who was meticulous about his legal and financial arrangements, and she had assumed that proximity was the same as knowledge. She had assumed that her access to the surface of his life was access to its structure. It was not. The mistake that greedy people consistently make is that they confuse visibility with understanding. They see the house, they do not ask about the deed. They see the lifestyle, they do not read the trust documents. They perform their confidence so completely that they forget to verify the ground beneath their feet, and then the ground is no longer there. I did not cause that. I simply did not warn her. There is a version of power that announces itself, that corrects in the moment, that confronts and argues and makes its presence known. It is the version that most people reach for because it is immediate and satisfying in the short term. And then there is the version that waits, that documents, that verifies, that builds in absolute quiet the conditions under which the truth will become visible on its own. My father built that version. He built it for me, in a library where his books are still on the shelves, on 14 acres where the light is very good in October. I am going to sit here a while longer. If you're new here, and I suspect some of you are given the week this channel has had, the subscribe button is where you'd expect it.